It was the summer of 1945. The Empire of Japan stood on the edge of ruin. Cities burned. Supplies vanished. But in the underground chambers of Tokyo, the high command still clung to a dying hope that the spirit of the samurai could defy the machines of the West. The air inside the bunker was thick. Cigarette smoke drifted like fog between the dim lights. Generals sat in silence, staring at a war map covered with red pins. Each red pin marked a place that had fallen. There were too many. General Yamizu leaned forward, his face pale under the flickering lamps. "Our losses are temporary," he said firmly. "America bleeds too. They will soon grow tired of this war." His words carried confidence, but his eyes told another story. Even he could feel it. The end was near. Far above them, the skies over Hiroshima were calm. Children were on their way to school. Workers opened their shops. The city was alive, unaware that it had only moments left to exist. At 8:15 a.m., a single B-29 bomber appeared in the distance. It carried a weapon unlike any in history, a bomb called Little Boy. When the doors opened, humanity stepped into a new age, the atomic age. A blinding flash tore through the sky. It was brighter than the sun, a light so fierce that it burned shadows into the walls. In an instant, 70,000 lives vanished. Buildings vaporized. The air itself turned to fire. Back in Tokyo, the first reports arrived hours later. A young officer, drenched in sweat, rushed into the war room. "Sir, Hiroshima, it's gone." The room went silent. Admiral Toyota frowned. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" The officer hesitated. "The entire city, sir. Flattened. Burned. Nothing remains." "Impossible," Yamizu snapped. "How many planes attacked?" "Only 3, sir," the officer said quietly. "3?" Yamizu repeated, disbelief twisting his voice. "You mean 300? The officer's voice broke. "No, sir. 3 planes, 1 bomb." Silence filled the bunker. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. No one could. Hours passed as radio operators scrambled for confirmation. Then came the second message, a voice trembling over the static. "Hiroshima has ceased to exist." Scientists were summoned immediately. They studied the radiation readings, the blast reports, the photographs from reconnaissance planes. Their faces turned pale. "This is not a conventional weapon," one of them whispered. "It is atomic. A single bomb that splits the very heart of matter." A long pause followed. No one had words. For years, Japan had believed courage was stronger than science. That faith could outlast machines. But now, one blinding flash had destroyed that belief forever. The next morning, the emperor himself requested an emergency meeting. He listened in silence as the scientists described the bomb, how it released energy beyond imagination, how it turned steel to dust and humans to shadows. He sat motionless, his hands folded tightly. At last he spoke. "If such a weapon exists, then continuing this war will mean the end of Japan itself." But not everyone agreed. Some generals demanded one final stand, a battle to the death. They spoke of honor, of loyalty, of the samurai spirit. They would rather see Japan die than surrender. Yet, even as they spoke, another coded message arrived. Reconnaissance confirmed. Hiroshima was gone. The smoke still rose for miles, black against the sky. In that moment, the truth settled over them like a shroud. Japan had reached a wall it could not break through. Not with bravery, not with sacrifice, not with faith. And as the meeting ended, one general whispered what all of them were thinking. If they have one such bomb, how many more do they have? The days after Hiroshima felt unreal. Tokyo was covered in silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm too powerful to describe. In the imperial bunker, the high command gathered once again. Faces were pale, uniforms wrinkled, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The emperor's scientists had confirmed it beyond doubt. The Americans had unleashed a weapon that used the very energy of the universe. They called it an atomic bomb. General Anami clenched his fists. "One city is not the end of Japan," he said firmly. He still believed the Americans were bluffing, that this was their only bomb, their only card. He could not accept that a single strike could erase an entire city. But the emperor was quiet. He had read reports that were never shown to the public. Descriptions of people melting into light, of bodies turned to shadows on the pavement, of fire so hot it burned the very air. He said softly, "We are fighting a power we cannot see." 2 days later, as the council argued over what to do next, a new message arrived. The operator's hands shook as he read the words aloud. "Sir, another city has been destroyed. Nagasaki." For a moment, no one breathed. General Yamizu closed his eyes, his voice breaking for the first time. "They've done it again." Reports from Nagasaki described the same unimaginable horror. A flash, a fireball, then nothing. Factories, schools, hospitals, homes, everything gone in an instant. Tens of thousands dead. The city reduced to ash. The room fell into chaos. Some shouted for immediate surrender. Others demanded retaliation. One officer slammed his sword against the table, shouting, "Better to die than bow to the enemy." The emperor raised his hand. The room went silent. His voice was low but steady. "We cannot win a war of science with swords and prayers," he said. "The enemy has touched the power of the stars. If we continue, we will vanish, not as warriors, but as ghosts." That night, Japan's leaders met in secret. Outside, Tokyo was dark, power cut to save the last of the fuel. Inside, the air was thick with despair. Prime Minister Suzuki spoke first. "Our people are starving. Our cities are dust. The army has no ammunition, no planes, no fuel. And now, the Americans hold the power of creation itself. Tell me, gentlemen, what is left to defend?" No one answered. Even the proudest generals lowered their eyes. But one voice rose in the silence, General Anami again. "If we surrender," he said, "we betray every soldier who died for the emperor. If we surrender, Japan dies with shame." The emperor stood. He rarely raised his voice, but this time, every word carried the weight of a nation. Japan dies with shame only if Japan ceases to exist. But if we continue this war, there will be no Japan left to feel shame. The men around the table bowed their heads. They knew. The war was over. Still, there was fear. Fear of what surrender would mean. Fear of losing everything they'd built. For centuries, Japan had lived by the code of Bushido, honor before life. Now they faced a truth that shattered that code forever. Honor meant survival, not destruction. On August 14th, 1945, the emperor made his decision. He would speak to the nation, something no emperor had ever done before. His message would end the war. The recording took place at night, in a small studio deep inside the imperial palace. As he spoke, his hands trembled slightly. He chose his words carefully. "To the people of Japan, we must endure the unendurable and suffer what cannot be suffered." Outside, the war still raged. Some soldiers refused to believe the truth. They tried to seize the recording before it could be broadcast. But loyal guards stopped them, protecting the voice that would change history. The next day, August 15th, 1945, the emperor's voice echoed across Japan. For the first time, his people heard him speak. The message was calm, sorrowful, and final. The empire had fallen. The war was over. Millions wept, not just from defeat, but from relief, that the fires had finally ended, that their children might live. In the imperial bunker, the high command sat in silence once again. There were no speeches, no orders, no maps. Only the sound of rain against the concrete walls. General Yamizu looked up and said quietly, "They never used their full power. Not once. We fought shadows and thought them equal." Outside, Japan lay in ruins. But somewhere in that ruin, a new nation was waiting to be born. One that would rebuild from ashes. One that had learned the true cost of pride. And as the world watched, the Japanese high command finally understood American power. Not just the power to destroy, but the power to end a war with a single decision. The morning of September 2nd, 1945, dawned quietly over Tokyo Bay. But on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, history stood still. The ship's steel hull glimmered in the sunlight, surrounded by a sea of American warships, hundreds of them. Each vessel represented the might of an industrial machine that had crushed two empires across two oceans. Above them, waves of aircraft darkened the sky, circling in formation like silent witnesses to the end of an age. At precisely 9 a.m., the Japanese delegation stepped onto the deck. Their footsteps echoed, soft, hesitant, carrying the weight of a fallen nation. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, leaning on his cane, led the group. Beside him, General Yashijiro Yumizu walked stiffly, his uniform perfect, his eyes hollow. They bowed deeply before the Allied representatives, the same gesture they once demanded from conquered nations. But somewhere in that ruin, a new nation was waiting to be born, one that would rebuild from ashes, one that had learned the true cost of pride. And as the world watched, the Japanese High Command finally understood American power, not just the power to destroy, but the power to end a war with a single decision. The morning of September 2nd, 1945, dawned quietly over Tokyo Bay. But on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, history stood still. The ship's steel hull glimmered in the sunlight, surrounded by a sea of American warships, hundreds of them. Each vessel represented the might of an industrial machine that had crushed two empires across two oceans. Above them, waves of aircraft darkened the sky, circling in formation like silent witnesses to the end of an age. At precisely 9 a.m., the Japanese delegation stepped onto the deck. Their footsteps echoed, soft, hesitant, carrying the weight of a fallen nation. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, leaning on his cane, led the group. Beside him, General Yashijiro Yumizu walked stiffly, his uniform perfect, his eyes hollow. They bowed deeply before the Allied representatives, the same gesture they once demanded from conquered nations. At the center stood General Douglas MacArthur, tall, stern, his presence radiating command. His voice carried through the ship's loudspeakers. "We are gathered here to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." As Shigemitsu signed the document of surrender, a gust of wind lifted the paper slightly, and for a brief second, every man on that deck knew the world would never be the same again. When Yumizu added his signature, he paused. He looked at the ink, then at the endless line of American ships surrounding them. He whispered, almost to himself, "They build all this while fighting Germany and building the weapon that ended us." The pen trembled in his hand, and then it was done. Japan's empire, built over decades of conquest and pride, ceased to exist with the scratch of a pen. As the ceremony ended, MacArthur spoke again, his words echoing across the harbor. "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always." Above, American aircraft flew in perfect formation, hundreds of them. The thunder of their engines was not a roar of war, but the heartbeat of victory. The Japanese officers watched in silence. That sound, once their greatest fear, was now the sound of survival. Later that day, as the delegation returned to Tokyo, General Yumizu looked out over the city. From the air, Tokyo looked like a graveyard of ashes, miles of blackened ruins where once millions had lived. He turned to his aide and said quietly, "Once we believed spirit could defeat machines, but we were blind. The machine was built by spirit, their spirit." The following weeks revealed truths that shocked even the most hardened officers. American occupation forces arrived with order, not vengeance. Their soldiers distributed food, rebuilt railways, restored water systems. The same nation that had reduced cities to ashes was now rebuilding them. Admiral Yanai, watching from his headquarters, whispered, "They conquered us with bombs, but they rule us with kindness." That is true power. Japanese scientists, given access to American records, learned the scale of the Manhattan Project. 130,000 people had worked in complete secrecy. Entire cities had been built for research. Billions of dollars spent, not to fight, but to create something beyond imagination. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading physicist, stared at the figures in disbelief. He murmured, "We could not have built one of their laboratories, let alone their weapon." As weeks turned into months, the truth sank deeper. America had not used its full strength. They had fought a two-ocean war, armed their allies, supplied the Soviets, built thousands of ships and planes, and still created the weapon that ended the war. General Anami, before his death, had written one final note. "We thought they were weak because they were free. We thought their democracy made them soft. We were wrong. It made them strong beyond comprehension." Foreign Minister Shigemitsu wrote in his diary after the surrender, "The harbor was filled with American ships, as far as the eye could see. This was only a fraction of their power, yet greater than our entire navy at its height. We prepared for war for 10 years. They prepared for peace and still defeated us." Under the American occupation, Japan's leaders were shown detailed reports, production numbers, factory outputs, research statistics. The figures were staggering. America had produced over 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Their factories never slept. Their economy never broke. Even while at war, American citizens lived better than Japan's people in peacetime. Prime Minister Suzuki said, quietly, "We believe they could not fight without comfort. But they fought with comfort, and still fought harder than we could imagine." By 1946, the old guard had been replaced by a new generation, one that no longer worshipped war, but progress. Japanese engineers, economists, and scientists began to rebuild their nation under American guidance. Factories reopened, this time producing not weapons, but tools, radios, and cars. The same discipline that once built war machines now built peace. Admiral Toyota, writing in 1946, summed up the change. "We began the war believing democracy was weakness. We end it knowing it is strength. Freedom creates innovation, and innovation creates power." In the years that followed, Japan transformed. The ashes of Hiroshima became a city of peace. The factories that once made engines of war now built engines for the world. And the people, once driven by the dream of conquest, became symbols of resilience. But the men who sat in that bunker in August 1945 would never forget the lesson burned into their history. They had believed courage could defeat technology, that faith could overcome machines, that sacrifice could balance power. Now they understood. Courage without knowledge is blindness. Faith without wisdom is ruin. And sacrifice means nothing without understanding the world you fight in. The American atomic bomb had not only ended a war, it had ended an era. As one Japanese historian would later write, "We fought the future with the weapons of the past. And when the future arrived, it came riding on a single bomb." Silence hung over Japan in the winter of 1945. Cities were nothing but dust. Millions were homeless. Families searched for faces they would never see again. And in that silence, the once mighty Japanese high command faced their reckoning. General Yamazu sat in a small, dimly lit interrogation room in Tokyo. Across the table, an American officer asked, "When did you realize the war was lost?" Yamazu hesitated. His eyes stared at the floor. "Not after Hiroshima," he said slowly. "After the first American soldier set foot in Japan and showed mercy." He paused, then added, "We understood power that day. Not just strength, but restraint. For men who had built their lives on the worship of power, mercy was something they had never respected. But now they saw, real strength was not in destruction, but in control." As the months passed, Tokyo was rebuilt under General MacArthur's command. The American soldiers, once feared as demons, became protectors. They shared their food, helped rebuild homes, and even played baseball with local children. To the surviving Japanese officers, this was a second shock, the moral power of their former enemy. Admiral Yanai wrote in his journal, "They came not as conquerors, but as teachers. They did not humiliate us. They helped us rise again." This is the true face of power. Meanwhile, in secret war crime tribunals, former leaders faced judgment. Some refused to speak. Others wept as they heard the testimonies of survivors. But in their last words, many expressed not hatred, but awe. General Anime, before his suicide, left behind a final message. I did not fear death, but I regret my blindness. We thought we could match their courage with our discipline. But courage without vision is only a beautiful way to die. Years later, as the world entered the atomic age, American scientists visited Japan to study the effects of the bomb. Among them was a young physicist named Philip Morrison. He met Japanese survivors and wept. He said, "We unleashed the power of the universe, but we forgot it would fall on people, not just enemies." When this reached the remaining members of the Japanese command, one of them reportedly said, "They have the weapon of gods and still feel sorrow. We sought to be gods, but forgot to be human." The Reconstruction years changed everything. Under American occupation, Japan adopted a new constitution, one that renounced war forever. The samurai spirit of the past transformed into the spirit of progress. Factories rose where ashes once lay, and new leaders emerged who believed that the pen, not the sword, would shape the future. In 1949, at a small university lecture, former Navy officer Masanori Ito addressed a group of students. He said softly, "America's power was not their bomb, not their ships, not their factories. It was their ability to learn, to build, to dream, even while fighting." Those words became the guiding light for a new Japan. The same nation that once waged war on modernity now became a symbol of it. In less than 2 decades, Japan rose from ruin to one of the world's greatest economies, building cars, technology, and cities that rivaled the West. But deep inside the hearts of those who remembered 1945, the memory of that moment, when the rising sun bowed to the stars and stripes, never faded. In 1960, an old veteran who had once stood guard outside the Imperial Palace during the war was asked by an American journalist, "Do you still hate America?" The veteran smiled faintly. "Hate," he said. "No. We feared them. Then we fought them. Now we learn from them." That sentiment echoed across the generations. Japan had not only lost a war, it had found its reflection. And in that reflection, it saw that the power it once sought through blood and fire could also be built through knowledge and peace. By the late 20th century, Japan became America's greatest ally in Asia. Its cities gleamed with neon light. Its factories powered the world. And in classrooms across the nation, children were taught that peace was not weakness. It was the highest form of strength. In the quiet shrine of Hiroshima, where the names of the fallen are inscribed in stone, a single phrase is carved: "Rest in peace, for the error shall not be repeated." Every year, American and Japanese officials stand side by side before that monument. Once enemies, now partners. Once destroyers, now builders. And somewhere in the eternal memory of history, the voices of the old Japanese high command still whisper, not in arrogance, but in understanding. The power of America was never the bomb. It was the mind that built it, and the heart that mourned it. The war had ended, but the lesson endures forever. Because in the end, true power is not the ability to destroy, it is the courage to rebuild.